I turned 36 on a Tuesday morning that felt exactly like every other morning before it. The alarm rang at 6:30, not because I wanted to wake up early, but because routine had long replaced desire in my life. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, counting the small cracks above the bed like I always did. They were familiar, comforting in a strange way, predictable. Predictable had become my entire life. Daniel was already awake beside me, scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. He didn't look at me when I opened my eyes. He rarely did anymore. "Happy birthday," he said without emotion, still focused on whatever held his attention. "Thank you," I replied softly. That was it. No kiss, no smile, no pause. I told myself not to read into it. I had become very good at that, minimizing my feelings, explaining away disappointment, convincing myself that expecting more was childish at my age. 36 wasn't 26. Life wasn't supposed to be exciting anymore. At least, that's what I had been telling myself for years. I moved through the morning on autopilot. Shower, coffee, makeup applied carefully, as if precision could replace passion. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who looked fine, healthy, put together. But something in her eyes felt dim, like a light that had been left on too long and forgotten. Daniel left before me, as usual. He grabbed his jacket, his keys, and said, "We'll do something later, okay? I have meetings all day." "Of course," I said. The door closed behind him with a final, familiar sound. I sat at the kitchen table alone, birthday coffee growing cold in my hands, and felt a wave of sadness I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't about the birthday. It was about the quiet understanding that nothing special was coming. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, if I didn't demand it. And I wasn't sure I knew how anymore. We had been married for 12 years. 12 years is a long time to slowly disappear without noticing. When we met, I was full of opinions, ambition, laughter. Daniel loved that about me, or so he said. He loved how alive I was. Somewhere along the way, I had traded that aliveness for stability. Our life looked good from the outside. We had decent jobs, a comfortable apartment in the city, mutual friends who saw us as solid. People envied us. I smiled politely when they said how lucky I was. Lucky. If they only knew how lonely I felt lying next to my own husband. The distance between us hadn't appeared overnight. It crept in quietly, disguised as fatigue, stress, responsibility. Conversations became functional. Affection became rare. Silence became easier than honesty. I told myself all couples went through this, that real love was quiet, that passion was for movies and younger people. Still, there were moments, small, painful moments when I felt something was wrong. Like the way Daniel guarded his phone now, or how he started showering immediately after coming home, or how he no longer asked about my day, even when I clearly needed him to. I noticed everything. I just didn't say anything. Fear has a way of making you complicit in your own unhappiness. That evening, I came home earlier than usual. Daniel wasn't there yet. The apartment felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I dropped my bag on the chair and went into the kitchen, moving quietly, not sure why. That's when I saw his phone. It was lying face up on the counter, buzzing softly as a notification appeared. I hadn't intended to look. I truly hadn't. But the screen lit up and my eyes betrayed me. A woman's name I didn't recognize, and a red heart. Time slowed in a way I'd only ever experienced in moments of shock. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My chest tightened, my hands trembled. A strange ringing filled my ears. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. In that instant, something inside me broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with devastating clarity. I sat down at the table, my legs suddenly weak, and tried to breathe. Part of me wanted to scream, another part wanted to pretend I had seen nothing, to put the phone back exactly as it was and continue living the half-life I had mastered so well. When Daniel came home, I acted normal. I smiled, I asked about his day, I even laughed at something he said, though I don't remember what it was. That night, we lay in bed together, backs turned slightly away from each other, a space between us that felt wider than ever. I stared into the darkness, replaying the image of that notification again and again. I realized then that this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about how long I had been betraying myself. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't ready for confrontation. What I felt was something quieter and more terrifying. Clarity, the kind that doesn't allow you to go back to ignorance. I understood that staying would slowly erase me completely. And for the first time in years, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for far too long. Is this really the life I want to grow old in? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew I was done pretending the question didn't exist.
The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. Daniel was still asleep, lying on his back, one arm stretched across the empty space between us, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. For a brief, irrational second, I wondered if I had imagined everything, if the message, the name, the heart had been a product of my growing insecurity. But my chest still felt tight, and fear doesn't linger like that without reason. I got out of bed quietly and went into the kitchen. The apartment looked the same as it always did, clean, orderly, carefully maintained. We had built a life that functioned well, like a machine that hadn't yet realized it was running without purpose. I made coffee and sat at the table, staring at the same spot on the wall where we had once hung photos from our early years together. They were gone now, replaced by neutral artwork we'd chosen because it matched the furniture. I couldn't remember when we had taken them down, or why. When Daniel finally emerged from the bedroom, he looked surprised to see me already dressed. "Early meeting?" he asked casually. "No," I said. "I just woke up." He nodded, poured himself coffee, and checked his phone immediately. The movement was automatic, practiced. That's when I realized something important. Whatever was happening in his life had already become normal to him, and that hurt more than the possibility of betrayal itself. "Who's Emily?" I asked. The question hung in the air between us, fragile and dangerous. Daniel froze, just for a second, but it was enough. He slowly put his phone down and looked at me, really looked at me. His face shifted through several emotions too quickly to name: surprise, calculation, resignation. "Why?" he asked. I felt a bitter smile touch my lips. "So you know exactly who I'm talking about." He sighed and sat across from me. "It's not what you think." Of course it wasn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I was calm in a way that scared even me. "Then tell me what it is," I said. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit I hadn't seen in years. "It just happened. We worked together. We started talking. That's all." A heart emoji doesn't look like "that's all," Daniel. Silence. I waited. I had waited for years already. What was another minute? Finally, he spoke. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I felt something inside me snap, not violently, but cleanly, like a thread being cut. "How far has it gone?" I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. I stood up, suddenly unable to stay seated. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were leaning in. "Do you love her?" I asked quietly. He looked down. "I don't know," he said. That was the moment my marriage ended, not with shouting or accusations, but with those 3 words, "I don't know." After 12 years, after everything we'd built, he didn't know? "I think you should leave," I said. He looked up, startled. "What?" "Not forever," I clarified, though I wasn't sure why I did. "Just go. I need space." Daniel opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. For the first time in a long time, he didn't fight for us. He simply nodded. "I'll pack some things," he said. I watched him move through the apartment, opening drawers, pulling out clothes, avoiding my eyes. This was the man I had loved, reduced to a stranger gathering pieces of a shared life like borrowed items. When the door finally closed behind him, the silence was overwhelming. I stood in the middle of the living room, unsure what to do with my hands, my thoughts, my future. I expected to collapse, to scream, to sob uncontrollably. Instead, I sat on the floor and laughed. It wasn't joy. It wasn't hysteria. It was disbelief, a release of tension that had been building for years. I stayed there for a long time, until the light outside shifted and the room darkened. The days that followed blurred together. I went to work, I answered emails, I smiled when required. Inside, I felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out my insides and left me functioning purely on muscle memory. At night, the loneliness was sharp. I reached for my phone instinctively, then remembered there was no one to call, no one who truly knew me anymore. Friends reached out when they heard. Some offered sympathy, others offered advice I didn't ask for. "You're still young. At least you found out now. Everything happens for a reason." None of it helped. What helped, unexpectedly, was movement. One evening, after sitting alone in the apartment for hours, I packed a small suitcase. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, mostly because I didn't know myself. I just knew I couldn't stay. I drove without a destination, the city lights fading behind me, the road stretching ahead like an unanswered question. For the first time in years, I wasn't going somewhere because I was supposed to. I was going because I needed to breathe. As the miles passed, something inside me loosened. The pain didn't disappear, but it softened around the edges. I realized although I had lost my marriage, I hadn't lost myself completely. Not yet. And for the first time since my birthday morning, a quiet, unexpected thought crossed my mind. Maybe this isn't the end. Maybe this is the beginning.
I didn't plan where I was going. I just kept driving until the city thinned out and the road began to feel less crowded, less demanding. By the time the sun started to set, I found myself near the coast, the air changing subtly as salt mixed with the smell of wet asphalt. I pulled into a small town I barely remembered visiting years ago, guided more by instinct than logic. I rented a modest room above an old guest house run by a woman named Margaret. She was in her late 60s, with kind eyes and a voice that carried no urgency. She didn't ask why I was there or how long I planned to stay. She simply handed me the key and said, "You'll sleep well here. People usually do." She was right. That first night, I slept without dreams. No arguments replayed in my head, no imagined conversations, just deep, heavy rest, like my body had finally been given permission to shut down. In the morning, I woke to the sound of waves. It startled me at first. For years, my mornings had been defined by alarms and traffic, by rushing and responsibility. This sound was different, steady, patient, unconcerned with my problems. I walked down to the beach barefoot, the sand cold and uneven beneath my feet.
The ocean stretched endlessly before me, and something about its indifference was comforting. It didn't care that my marriage had ended. It didn't care that I was 36 and unsure of who I was supposed to be next. It just existed. For the first few days, I did very little. I worked remotely for a few hours each morning, answering emails and completing tasks with mechanical efficiency. In the afternoons, I walked, sometimes for miles, sometimes only a few steps before sitting on a bench and watching the water. I cried when I needed to. I didn't apologize to myself for it. I began writing in a notebook I had brought without thinking. At first, the pages filled with anger, things I wished I had said, moments I wished I had handled differently. Then came sadness, regret, guilt. Eventually, without effort, something else appeared: honesty. I wrote about how small I had made myself to keep the peace, how I had confused endurance with love, how afraid I had been to start over, as if staying unhappy was somehow safer than risking the unknown. One afternoon, as I sat in a small cafe near the shore, Margaret appeared beside my table with a cup of tea I hadn't ordered. "You look like someone who's learning how to breathe again," she said simply. I smiled, surprised by the accuracy of her words. "I think I forgot how," I admitted. She nodded. "It happens when we spend too long living for someone else." She didn't say anything more, and she didn't need to. That cafe became part of my routine. The staff stopped asking my name and simply nodded when I came in. Familiarity without expectation felt like a gift. That's where I met Ethan. He was sitting at the table next to mine, reading an old paperback with the cover nearly worn away. He looked up once, smiled politely, and went back to his book. No lingering glances, no curiosity that felt invasive. We spoke for the first time a few days later, when the power went out and the cafe fell into unexpected darkness. "Guess that's our cue to talk," he said lightly. We laughed, and something about the ease of it surprised me. Ethan was honest in a quiet way. He didn't perform, he didn't impress. He told me he had moved there after a divorce of his own, that he worked with his hands now because thinking too much had once nearly destroyed him. We didn't exchange dramatic stories. We spoke about simple things: books we loved, places we missed, mistakes we had made without turning them into lessons yet. There was no rush, no hidden agenda. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to be anything other than myself. As days turned into weeks, I noticed changes in myself that were subtle but profound. I laughed more easily. I slept better. I stopped checking my phone for messages that would never come. Daniel crossed my mind less often. When he did, the memories felt distant, muted, like scenes from a life I had already lived and outgrown. One evening, sitting on the beach as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan asked me something I hadn't been prepared for. "Are you afraid of going back?" he asked. I thought about it carefully. "Yes," I said, "but not in the way I used to be afraid of leaving." That was the difference. I realized that this place hadn't fixed me. It had simply given me enough quiet to hear myself again, to remember that I had a voice, desires, boundaries. I was still healing, still uncertain, but I was no longer broken. And as I stood there, the waves brushing against the shore in endless repetition, I understood something deeply and clearly. I didn't need to rush into a new life. I just needed to stop running from my own. I didn't expect Daniel to call. When his name appeared on my phone one quiet afternoon, I stared at the screen for a long moment, my heart reacting before my mind could catch up. It wasn't longing that I felt. It was something closer to reflex, muscle memory from a life I had lived for more than a decade. I let it ring. Then, against my better judgment, I listened to the voicemail he left. His voice sounded tired, older, less certain than I remembered. "Hey, it's me. I don't know if you'll want to hear this, but I've been thinking a lot. About us. About everything. I made a mistake. I miss you. I miss what we had. If you're willing to talk, I'd like that." He paused before hanging up, as if waiting for an answer that wouldn't come. I put the phone down and sat there, listening to the distant sound of the ocean drifting through the open window. For months I had imagined this moment, what I would say, how strong I would sound, how clearly I would explain my pain. Now that it was here, I felt strangely calm. Ethan found me later that evening on the beach, sitting with my knees drawn up, watching the sky turn deep shades of blue and gray. "You look like someone just opened a door you thought was locked," he said gently. I smiled faintly. More like a door I finally forgot about. I told him about the call, not because I owed him an explanation, but because I trusted him enough to be honest. "And what do you want to do?" he asked. That question stayed with me long after we parted ways for the night. What did I want? For so long, my choices had been shaped by fear of loneliness, of failure, of starting over at an age when society quietly suggests you should already be settled. Staying in my marriage felt safer than facing uncertainty, but I had learned something important during my time away. Safety without truth is just another kind of prison. That night, I barely slept. Memories surfaced uninvited. Holidays, shared jokes, moments of genuine tenderness that had once made our life together feel meaningful. I didn't deny them. I didn't rewrite history to make it easier to walk away. What I questioned was the future those memories were pointing towards. The next morning, I returned Daniel's call. We spoke politely at first, cautiously circling the past like it might bite if touched too directly. He told me things hadn't worked out with the other woman, that he'd been confused, overwhelmed, lost. I listened. I always had. "I think I took you for granted," he said finally. "I didn't realize what I was losing until you were gone." I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. "I was already gone long before I left," I said. There was silence on the line. "I don't hate you, but I can't come back to a life where I have to make myself smaller just to be chosen." He didn't argue. He didn't promise to change. He simply said he understood. And for the first time, I believed him. When the call ended, I felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because I had finally chosen honesty over habit. Later that day, I walked through the town with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I noticed details I had missed before, the way light reflected off the shop windows, the sound of laughter drifting from a nearby cafe, the warmth of the sun on my skin. Life felt present again. Ethan and I didn't rush into anything. What we shared grew slowly, rooted in respect rather than desperation. We spoke openly about our fears, our boundaries, our pasts. There were no promises made in the heat of emotion, only quiet consistency. One evening, as we cooked dinner together in the small kitchen of my rented room, he looked at me and said, "You don't act like someone who's running anymore." I thought about that for a moment. I'm not. I'm standing still long enough to see where I actually want to go. He smiled. That's a good place to be. As my stay in the town stretched longer than I had originally planned, I faced another choice: return to the city and the life I had known, or build something new from the ground up. The answer came not as a dramatic revelation, but a quiet certainty. I wasn't afraid of starting over anymore. I was afraid of going back to a life that no longer fit, and that, I realized, was growth.
I used to believe that happy endings arrived all at once, in grand moments that erased the pain that came before them. I thought happiness would feel like certainty, like fireworks, like something unmistakable. I was wrong. Happiness, I learned, feels quiet, steady, honest. The decision to stay didn't happen in a single moment. It formed slowly, through ordinary days that felt unexpectedly right, through mornings that began without dread, through evenings that didn't require emotional armor. I called my manager first, asked about transferring fully to remote work. She hesitated, then surprised me by saying yes. Apparently, I had proven my reliability long ago. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from possibility. For the first time, my future felt like something I was actively choosing, not enduring. I moved out of the guest house and into. I used to believe that happy endings arrived all at once, in grand moments that erased the pain that came before them. I thought happiness would feel like certainty, like fireworks, like something unmistakable. I was wrong. Happiness, I learned, feels quiet, steady, honest. The decision to stay didn't happen in a single moment. It formed slowly, through ordinary days that felt unexpectedly right, through mornings that began without dread, through evenings that didn't require emotional armor. I called my manager first, asked about transferring fully to remote work. She hesitated, then surprised me by saying yes. Apparently, I had proven my reliability long ago. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from possibility. For the first time, my future felt like something I was actively choosing, not enduring. I moved out of the guest house and into a small apartment near the water. It wasn't perfect. The floors creaked, the windows let in too much wind, but it was mine, entirely mine. I furnished it slowly, thoughtfully, nothing chosen to impress anyone else, just things that made me feel comfortable, grounded, real. Daniel and I finalized the divorce without drama. There were no last-minute pleas, no accusations, just acceptance. We had both changed, and the life we once shared no longer existed. When I signed the papers, I expected to feel grief. Instead, I felt relief. Not because the years hadn't mattered, but because they no longer defined me. Ethan remained a constant presence, though never a requirement. He didn't fill a void, he stood beside me while I learned how to occupy my own space again. Our relationship grew naturally, built on conversations rather than promises, on showing up, not rescuing, on choosing each other without obligation. One evening, as we walked along the shore, the sky painted in soft pinks and oranges, he stopped and looked at me. "You're different from when I met you." I smiled. "So are you." "No," he said gently. "You're lighter." I thought about that later, alone in my apartment, listening to the waves outside my window. I realized he was right. I no longer carried the weight of unspoken needs, of shrinking to be loved, of convincing myself that survival was the same as happiness. I had learned to listen, to myself most of all. On my 37th birthday, I woke up early again, but this time it wasn't routine that pulled me from sleep. It was sunlight spilling across the room and the sound of the ocean moving, as it always had, without urgency. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the day begin. There was no emptiness in the quiet. Later, friends called. Margaret brought over a small cake without candles. Ethan cooked dinner that night, laughing when he burned the first attempt and trying again without frustration. There was no grand celebration, just presence. And that was enough. I thought about the woman I had been a year earlier, sitting at a kitchen table in a city apartment, afraid to ask herself the hardest questions, afraid that choosing herself would mean ending up alone. She hadn't known then that being alone and being lonely were not the same thing. She hadn't known that sometimes losing the life you planned makes room for the life you actually need. I don't know what the future holds. I don't pretend that pain won't return in different forms. Life is still unpredictable. Love is still a risk. But now I face those uncertainties as myself, whole, present, not afraid to walk away from what diminishes me. I am 36 years old, and for the first time, I am not waiting for my life to begin. I am living it.